And tonight we have the privilege of speaking about the parsha of excuse me, Bahalotcha. Let's try again. Bahalotcha, which has a lot of different things that happened in the Midbar. We're in year 2 of the Exodus, and we're going to focus primarily on chapter 9 tonight. So let's begin with getting the source sheet up. And we're going to probably spend most of the time focusing basically on the first pasuk, which gives us a time setting and what's going on in this chapter, or at least the first half of this chapter. So first, the Parshanim are going to compare chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 1, verse 1. And that's why I've highlighted in yellow. Both of these psukim begin with Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe b'midbar Sinai. Chapter 1 tells us that it happened B'echad lachodesh hasheni, on the first day of the second month, Bashana Hashenit, in the second year. Let's say Tamei Eretz Mitzrayim, from leaving Egypt. Whereas our parsha tells us that this chapter 9 event happens Bashana Hashenit, also in the second year, but B'chodesh Rishon, in the first month. So that the events described in the beginning of chapter 9 precede those beginning in chapter 1. And that is what we're going to spend a lot of time discussing tonight. But before we do that, I want to just quickly go through what happens in chapter 9 so that we will have at least some kind of background understanding what the parsha is talking about. So it says very simply, Hashem commands Moshe on the first month after they've left, of the second year after they've left Egypt. Basically, we're talking about Nisan 2449. Hashem commands Moshe, "V'yasu b'nei Yisrael et hapasach b'moado," that b'nei Yisrael should make the Korban Pesach in its appointed time. Remember that when the Torah talks about the Pesach, it's always talking about the Korban. When it's talking about the holiday, it always uses the term Chag HaMatzot. Even though we colloquially call the Chag Pesach, in the Torah, Pesach always refers to the Korban. When should they make the Korban Pesach? On the 14th day of this month that Hashem is speaking to Moshe. They make it in the Korban Pesach is offered in the afternoon in the appropriate time. And Hashem just tells Moshe, according to all the laws which we already learned in Sefer Shemot about the Korban Pesach should be made. Okay, so that's section 1 is Hashem's command to Moshe. Section 2 is what happens. So Moshe tells Bnei Yisrael to bring the Korban Pesach, and they bring the Korban Pesach when? Barishon, first month, 14th day of the month, in the afternoon, b'midbar Sinai. Even though they're in the desert, they bring the Korban Pesach, like Hashem commands Moshe, Bnei Yisrael. Seemingly innocuous. Bnei Yisrael, Hashem commands Moshe, they should bring the Korban Pesach, they bring it. Theoretically, that should be the end of the parsha. But the parsha then continues because something out of the ordinary happened. And we go to verse 6. There were some men who were tamei because they had come in contact with a dead body. And they could not bring the Korban Pesach on that day. They came before Moshe and before Aaron on that day. And they said, these men said a love. Now, interestingly, it doesn't say Vayomer Alehem. It says they came before Moshe and Aaron, but it says they spoke to him. Okay, interestingly enough, obviously it's the speaking to him could be interpreted they spoke to Moshe and Aaron as singularly, but we would have expected it to say Alehem to them. But clearly their question is not directed to Aaron. Aaron is only mentioned because they wanted to give kavod to Aaron because he happened to be sitting next to Moshe at the time they approached with this question. That seems to be the consensus among the Parshanim who discussed this, that the reason Aaron is mentioned is because, others say the reason Aaron is mentioned is because it has direct bearing on him as the Kohen, has to be the one who, when Moshe gives the answer, whether they will be allowed to bring it or not, he's the one who's going to have to offer the offering if they are allowed to bring it. However, the primary recipient of the question, and that is alluded to by the word a love to him and not alehem to them, is that Moshe is the one being asked the question. And here's what they said: we are tamei. We have come in contact with a dead body. Lama nigara. Why should it be lessened for us that we should not be able to bring the offering of Hashem in its appropriate time together with all of Bnei Yisrael? Moshe answered them. Again, as I said, the question is directed to him. He answers them. Imdu, stay here. Let's see what Hashem has to say. It's a very good question. Are you allowed to bring the Korban Pesach if you are tamei now? And according to many of the parshatim, the question is if their tumah was going to end that day and they were going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach at night, are they able to bring it on that day? In other words, even though we know that a person who is tamei cannot eat from the Korban Pesach unless all of the congregation is tamei, what about an individual who was going to be tamei at nighttime when the time for eating the Korban Pesach came, but was still tamei at the time of offering it in the afternoon? But yeah, Hashem answers Moshe's question, which is pretty good. Okay, you got a question. Moshe says, let's hear what Hashem has to say, and Hashem immediately comes and tells Moshe the following. Tell Bnei Yisrael, tell the Jewish people saying the following: Ish, ki yatamei lanefesh. If a person is tamei because they came in contact with a dead body, not any other type of tumah, or they happen to be far away, lachem, for you, or at any point in Jewish history, where the tzibur is bringing a Korban Pesach, Yasa Pesach Lashem, this person who is either not able to make it to Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach, or is tamei on Erev Pesach because they've come in contact with the corpse. When does he make a Pesach? B'chodesh hasheni bi'arba'asar yom bein arba'im yasuota. He should make his Korban Pesach on the 14th day, not of the first month, but of the second month. Hence what we call today Pesach Sheni, that there is a second opportunity. Since the Korban Pesach is a Korban that everybody has to bring, we give it a second opportunity. Most Chagim, you don't get a second chance. The Chag goes, you miss the Chag, Chag is over. You don't get a chance to sit in the Sukkah a month later. You don't get a chance to light your Hanukkah candles a month later. You don't get a chance to hear the shofar a month later. But here, in terms of bringing the Korban Pesach, not in terms of keeping the holiday, but in terms of bringing the Korban Pesach, you get a second chance a month later. However, certain laws of the Korban Pesach still applies. Al matzah d'morim yofluhu. When you eat your Korban Pesach, you have to eat matzah and maror together with it, even though it's not Pesach night. It's not the 14th, the 15th of Nisan. You still, when you bring a Korban Pesach on Pesach Sheni, it has to be eaten together with matzah and maror. And also other laws that apply to the Korban Pesach will also apply, such as lo yashir mimenu ad boker. You're not allowed to eat the Korban the next day. It has to be eaten that night. The etzem lo yishbro. You're not allowed to break a bone while you're eating Korban Pesach. These are all laws that apply to the Korban Pesach always. It has to follow all the laws that apply to a regular Korban Pesach, apply to this, but that's only as far as the Korban Pesach. You do not have to make a whole Seder. You don't have to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, but you do have to follow the laws of the Korban Pesach. Now, a person who was tahar and was not far away from the Beit HaMikdash at the time, they could have brought the Korban Pesach, and he did not bring the Korban Pesach. The penalty for not bringing the Korban Pesach is karet, being cut off from the Jewish people. Ki korban Hashem lo hikrit b'moado, because he has not brought an offering for Hashem in its proper time. Cheto yisah yishahu, this person shall bear his sin. And then when you have a convert who lives with you, he also Pesach Hashem and wants to make Pesach. He also follows all the rules of Korban Pesach. There's one law for a person who is converted and is committed to becoming a Jew. Has the same law in terms of Korban Pesach. Couple of just quick points that. The fact here is that Korban Pesach is one of only two positive mitzvot that the Torah tells us there is a penalty for not fulfilling them. Ordinarily, for not fulfilling a positive command, the penalty is you miss the opportunity to do a positive command. The two are, of course, a Brit Milah, a person who fails to have a Brit Milah, unless there are medically indicated that they can't, and a person who does not bring a Korban Pesach when there is a availability to bring Korban Pesach, there is a Beit Hamikdash. Those two are the two positive commandments that have the penalty of karet, being cut off from the Jewish people. Again, to show us the importance of the Korban Pesach, that it is an integral part of the Jewish people and of showing your allegiance to the Torah and the mitzvot, as is, of course, Brit Milah. Okay, I want to focus, as I said, most primarily on the first verse, which, as I said, it seems that this first verse is out of chronological order. That's what Rashi is going to start with. Achodesh Harishon. Our parsha, as we said, this whole law of the Korban Pesach, bringing the Korban Pesach, is given to Moshe on the first day of Nisan, in year 2, year 2449 from creation. And the chapter that begins this book of Bamidbar 8 chapters ago, or 2 parsha 2 weeks ago, which was the beginning of ER a month later. So the question the Parshanim are going to try to wrestle with is, why is this parsha out of chronological order? Parsha Shemarosh HaSefer, Rashi says, the parsha that begins the book of Bamidbar Lo Nemra Ad ER, was not given to Moshe until the first of ER, and it specifically tells us that in the beginning of the first pasuk, the pasuk that I quoted above. Lamadata, this comes to teach you She'ein Seder Mukdam Umuchar BaTorah, that the Torah is not intended to be a historical, chronologically accurate book, not chronological, it's in chronological order. It is chronologically actual when obviously when a date is given, it's the correct date, but it means that there's no chronological order in the Torah in general. However, and Rashi and other commentators are going to tell us that anytime we find a section that's not in chronological order, we got to figure out a reason why the Torah decided to change the chronological order and what's the lesson that we have to learn from it. And that's what Rashi is now going to say. Well, if that's the case, Rashi says, why isn't this parsha at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar? Why is the parsha of counting at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar? Mipnei shu genutan shel Yisrael. This chapter does not speak highly of Am Yisrael. That's what Rashi wants to tell us. Why? What is it that doesn't speak highly of Am Yisrael about this chapter? Not what happens in this chapter, because what happens in this chapter, we're going to hopefully discuss a little bit later, is very positive for Am Yisrael. But in general, Rashi says this section is negative, shines a negative light on Am Yisrael. Why? Shekol 40 shana shel Yisrael b'Amidbar, the entire 40 years that Bnei Yisrael were in the desert. Lo hikrivu ela Pesach zeh bilvad. This is the only time they brought the Korban Pesach. So for the next 38 years, they are not going to bring a Korban Pesach. This is the only one that's going to be brought in the Midbar. The Parshanim are going to try to focus on what's going on and why that is. And let's go further, and we'll start with Chizkuni. Okay. Okay, it says again in the first month, Ksiv hacha b'midbar Sinai, uksiv hasa b'midbar Sinai. In both our pasuk and in the first pasuk of the book, it says b'midbar Sinai, be'echad lachodesh, ma lahalon rosh chodesh, af kan rosh chodesh, kan perish Rashi, and that's what Rashi. That's what the Chizkuni first wants to tell us, that we should understand that this parsha about the Korban Pesach was spoken to Moshe on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which, by the way, I don't know. It's interesting that it's the same. It's exactly a year since Hashem has spoken to Moshe on Rosh Chodesh Nisan back in Egypt at the beginning of the story, at the end of the story of the plagues, and the beginning of the story of the redemption, also happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And also there, Hashem gives Moshe the command for the first Korban Pesach. So here again, exactly a year later, on the first day of Nisan, Hashem gives Moshe the command for the second year's Pesach. Parsha Zu Shabrosha Sefer Lo Nemar Ad Iyar. Rashi then says that the beginning of the book is in Chodesh Iyar, Lamata Shein Seder Mukdam Umuchar BaTorah, that there's no chronological order in the Torah. And again, he quotes Rashi, Lama Lo Pasuk Bezu B'nei Shu Genutan. He asks again, and he quotes Rashi, who says again, we didn't start with this chapter because it reflects poorly on Am Yisrael. V'im Tomar, but his Chizkuni says, I don't understand. Eze Genutu, what is the negative light that this is shining on Am Yisrael? Hare parshat Bo, we already learned in parshat Bo, where we are given the commandment of the Korban Pesach, not the one that's going to be in Egypt, but the one that's going to be every year for the rest of history. Tala katuv mitzvah Pesach b'biyatal la'aretz. We are told that we are supposed to bring the Korban Pesach only when we arrive in Eretz Yisrael. It says, "V'yaki tavo el aretz, shmartem et avodah hazot." We know that the pasuk tells us that when we get into Eretz Yisrael, we have a mitzvah on Erev Pesach to bring the Korban Pesach, but we don't have it if we're not in Eretz Yisrael. Ella, in other words, they weren't commanded. Chizkuni's question is, if they weren't commanded to bring the Korban Pesach till they got to Eretz Yisrael, what is it? Why does it say negatively that they didn't bring it the rest of the years they were in the desert? Hashem specifically commands them in year 2 to bring it. They bring it. The rest of the time, there's no command to bring it. So it seems strange that we would have this negative aspect, Chizkuni says. However, then he gives a possible teretz. Ela yesh lomar, possibly genut hu lahem, the negative aspect of this is if they hadn't sinned by complaining, they would have immediately, after bringing this Korban Pesach, they would have entered Eretz Yisrael, so that by the next year Pesach, they would have already been in Eretz Yisrael. As the Torah tells us later on in this parsha, in our parsha, a month after Pesach, on the second month, on the 20th month, they left Har Sinai to travel to Eretz Yisrael. And the goal was to immediately enter Eretz Yisrael and conquer Eretz Yisrael. We're immediately traveling to Eretz Yisrael. Uperish Rashi miyad at shlosha yamim anu nichnasim la'aretz. They were, when they left Har Sinai, they were supposed to have travel for 3 days and go into Eretz Yisrael. However, they took a few detours. And they should have, by the next year, they should have already been in Eretz Yisrael to bring the Korban Pesach. And now they sinned. Asu sham es chodesh. They waited in Kivrot Hava. They were there for a month. Hashem punished them that for 30 days they were punished. They could not travel because they complained that they wanted meat. And from there they arrived at Chatzerot. They had to wait 7 days because Miriam had Zarat, and they waited until Miriam was cured. And then they got to Midbar Paran by Shalchu Meraglim, and that was where they decided to send the Meraglim. And that's how they ended up in the desert for 40 years, because after they sent the spies, they didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. So the problem here that this reflects negatively on Am Yisrael is the fact, not that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach per se, but the fact that they weren't in Eretz Yisrael to bring the Korban Pesach. That's what Chizkuni said. This was the problem. The problem was that they should have already been in Eretz Yisrael by the time year 3 came around, and they weren't. And that's Genut of Am Yisrael. Now we're going to go to Ramban. The Ramban goes into this in great detail. Okay. Firstly, he brings down the source, Sifrei and Pesachim, She'ein Mukdam Muchar B'Torah. Torah is not in chronological order. The reason this is out of order, Ki kasher ba hasefer hazeh haravi'i. Ramban is going to now give us a whole outline of the beginning of the 4th book of the Torah, which is Sefer, what we call Sefer Bamidbar, Numbers, Chumash Pekudim. Kasher ba Sefer hazeh haravi'i lazkir hamitzvot shenitztavu Yisrael b'midbar Sinai l'sha'atam. The first thing that this book wants to outline is those commandments that were incumbent on Am Yisrael while they were in the desert, that they were specifically for that generation. Therefore, before it talked about this, it wanted to first talk about complete the end of Sefer Shemot, where it talked about the construction of the Mishkan, and it wanted to conclude the building and the construction of the Mishkan, the Tikkuno Kol Yemei Hamidbar, and its establishment of how it was going to be laid out and how the tribes were going to camp around it. Because we finished Sefer Shemot, because remember, Vayikra is almost, not that it's parenthetical, but it's not in the historical order, because the Sefer of Vayikra deals with all of the laws of the Mishkan, as Ramban said at the beginning of Vayikra, that now we finished reading of the construction of the Mishkan. We have all the laws that pertain to the Mishkan of Tuma and Tara and Karbanot. And now in Bamidbar, we're basically picking up the narrative of what happened to Am Yisrael in the desert after the Mishkan is constructed. So Raman says before we go into the events that happened, the Torah wants to describe the layout, the lay of the land, how the Mishkan was set up, how the camp of the Leviim surrounded it, how the camp of Israel surrounded the camp of the Leviim, and all of the jobs of the Leviim in terms of taking down the Mishkan and reassembling it every time they moved. So that all precedes any of the events that happen. And then it goes back and reviews the Chanukah HaMizbeach, that the Nisiim, the heads of the tribes, brought these offerings of the Sheviu Agalora Sheyusa Otam Bahem, Kol Eid Hayotam Bamidbar, about the wagons that they brought to carry and transport the Mishkan while they were in the desert. Vishlim Karbanot Chanukah HaMizbeach Shoyim Yachad B'Nisan. And then it completed with the telling us about all the offerings that they brought to inaugurate the Mizbeach. The Acher Kach Shav Laskir Azhara Shehis Here Otam Shelo Yishkechu Mitzvah Teha Pesach. And now finally the Torah gets around to telling us that we should not forget the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, that we have to bring the Korban Pesach. The Aldad Rabotain, when the Ramban, of course, quotes the Memar Chazal, Lo Nohado Bamidbar Elashana Zubilvan. This, for the 40 years they were in the desert, this was the only time they brought the Korban Pesach. Why? The reason is, Lefi Shalom Malu Bamidbar, Vaitamilat Zecharim Bavadim Makevet Bahem. We know that the entire 40 years that Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar, from the time they left Har Sinai, they did not perform circumcision on the children that were born while they were traveling in the desert. Reason being because it was sakana to have them perform Brit Milah if Am Yisrael would have to travel. The first 3 days after Brit Milah is very dangerous, and therefore they did not perform Brit Milah because they might be traveling within the next 3 days at all time. They never knew how long they were going to be camped at a place, and because there was potential that they might be traveling through the desert, they did not perform circumcisions the entire 40 years they were in the Midbar, as we read at the beginning of the book of Yoshua, that when they finally get to Eretz Yisrael, they cross the Yarden, Yoshua performs a mass circumcision of Am Yisrael right before they bring the first Pesach when they're in Eretz Yisrael under Yoshua. So therefore, the fact that that even the ones who were circumcised could not bring the Korban Pesach because they had met family members or servants who were not circumcised, and that meant that they could not bring the Korban Pesach. And it seems possible that the reason that we needed it, that Hashem needs to tell Moshe that yes, there is I want you specifically to tell Am Yisrael that they're supposed to bring the Korban Pesach. Because the original command, as we saw in Chizkuni, the original command to bring the Korban Pesach every year is only when they get to Eretz Yisrael. As the pasuk tells us, regarding the Korban Pesach, we're only commanded to bring the Korban Pesach when we get to Eretz Yisrael, the land Hashem has given us, and then we have a mitzvah of Korban Pesach. When you come into Eretz Yisrael proper, then you have a mitzvah of Korban Pesach. But until you get there, there's no mitzvah. And that's why Hashem has to specifically command Moshe in year 2, yes, bring the Korban Pesach. In another verse, he said, and now, here we're in the Midbar, we haven't gotten to Eretz Yisrael. Hashem wanted them to perform this mitzvah of Korban Pesach in year 2, even though they hadn't yet gotten to Eretz Yisrael, but it requires a specific command, because the command that they got back when they were in Egypt did not yet apply because they hadn't reached Eretz Yisrael. In order they should remember their redemption, because we want the reason we bring the Korban Pesach and we have the whole concept of Pesach is that we should always remember that Hashem redeemed us with great miracles that were done for us and for our ancestors. Netat lemina avot haroim livnehem. And as time goes on, we have to be able to pass that along from the parents who witnessed it firsthand to the children who have been born who haven't witnessed it firsthand. Uvenehem livnehem, and their children to their children, and so on and so on. In other words, Pesach is an important part of the chain of tradition, that it is only through having a Seder and bringing the Korban Pesach when we can. All of these things are always to remind us of our origin, how we started in Egypt, how Hashem took us out of Egypt. A critical component of throughout the whole Torah, the concept of Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, of remembering that Hashem took us out of Egypt, is a critical component of the belief of Am Yisrael. Even though originally, when Hashem first gives this mitzvah, it's only when you're in Eretz Yisrael, to say there's no mitzvah of bringing Korban Pesach outside of Eretz Yisrael. However, this one time, this and the Pesach that's brought in Egypt are the only times the Korban Pesach is brought outside of Eretz Yisrael. Every other time a Korban Pesach was brought, it was in Eretz Yisrael, because that is where the mitzvah applies. It's part and parcel of our attachment and our ownership statement of Eretz Yisrael, is that Hashem took us out of Egypt, and that's why we have the holiday of Chag HaMatzot. We bring the Korban Pesach to remind us at all times that we are in Eretz Yisrael, not because of anything except that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim to give us Eretz Yisrael. That's why we're here. We're not here because of any UN proclamations or any League of Nations decisions or anything else. We're here because HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised us this land. And again, he quotes the Midrash, they only did it during that first year. They had children who were not circumcised. As the Gemara in Yevamot explains, that they did not perform circumcision in the desert because of the danger that they might be traveling immediately, which could be life-threatening for somebody who's just undergone a Brit Milah. Sifrei has a slightly different way of looking at this. Amru, he says the following: They made the Korban Pesach this time in the second year. They made the Korban Pesach. Basically, this is who Rashi is quoting, the Sifrei, that this chapter reflects negatively on Am Yisrael because they only made one Pesach the entire 40 years they were in the desert. And it says, and the Navi says, did you bring me Karbanot all these 40 years that you were in the Midbar? Darshu Kain min hakatuv hazeh. He explained it from this pasuk. Shnara Yasuda Pesach Parishon Bi'arvasal Chosh Be'Barim B'Midbar Sinai Ki Amikra Miyutar. This whole pasuk that they made the Korban Pesach on the 14th day of the first month in the afternoon in Midbar Sinai is an extra pasuk, because it could have just said they made because the I saw Pesach called Hashem Moshe. They could have done it, said it. They made it exactly as Hashem spoke to Moshe. Why do we need to add that it was on the month of the 14th and this and all these other things to tell us that this was the only time they brought it? The day and the place are mentioned to hint to the fact they only made one Korban Pesach the whole time they were in the desert, and this is where it is derived from, because it specifically mentions the day that they made the Korban Pesach. If not, it would have just said they made the Korban Pesach like Hashem commanded them, which we would have assumed meant they did it every year. The fact that it specifically mentions the day means that they didn't do it every year. V'higenutan, and that is what reflects poorly on Am Yisrael. And it seems probable, Ramban says further, Shagnut Hazeh, what is negative, what makes this such a negative condemnation of Am Yisrael, who kil kalatam b'inyan hameraglim. The fact that they sinned through the Ched Meraglim, Shemimenu need not do, because for that they were put in, they were ostracized from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence. Lo nashva lehem ruach hatzfonit v'lo malu. And therefore the north wind did not blow, and that which is a healing wind, and therefore they did not perform the circumcision. Lefikach nestu b'chol hakadoshim, and therefore they could not bring any karbanot. So even though we just spent a whole book of Vayikra learning all about the laws of karbanot, Ramban wants to imply that they did not bring any karbanot the entire 40 years they were in the desert, except this Korban Pesach. That's it. There were no other karbanot, according to one opinion. Oh, shetiyah brayta azuk divrei haomer. However, or it's possible that this follows a different opinion that what ein milat zachar v'adam ma'akevet bo, that in reality that they could have brought the Korban Pesach. Those that had been circumcised could have brought the Korban Pesach, even though there were people who were not circumcised. The one who was circumcised should have brought the Korbanot. And they were able to bring the Korban Pesach. From a halachic perspective, they could have brought these Korbanot. They were lazy below us, and they didn't perform it. And that's a very, very strong condemnation. Here they were allowed to do it. They weren't commanded, but they could have done it because they themselves had Brit Milah, but they didn't. They chose not to because they didn't want to, because there was no specific command. And that Ramban wants to say is, at least according to this opinion, is a rather negative statement. That here they had the opportunity to perform lots of mitzvot and they chose not to. I think the first one makes more sense, that they weren't able to because they didn't perform Brit Milah. Why does the second one that they could have but they chose to be lazy doesn't make sense? Moshe was alive this whole 40 years. If they Yisrael were just not doing it because they were lazy, Moshe would have pushed them to do it. He wouldn't have let them look for a loophole where that they didn't necessarily need. But Raman says finally, don't think that just because they didn't bring the Korban Pesach, Shiva, the 7 days of the Chag HaMatzot, of what we call Pesach, that they didn't have chametz, the Torah doesn't have to tell us that they kept that mitzvah, because that mitzvah was given to all of Am Yisrael. Because the mitzvah of not eating chametz, the negative commandment of not eating chametz, the 7 days of the Chag, that's applicable even if you're not in Eretz Yisrael. And concerning the not eating chametz and getting rid of all chametz in your possession, it already said that it was already everywhere. So there's a difference between the Korban Pesach, which is only an obligation in Eretz Yisrael, and keeping all the other concepts of the Chag, such as, presumably, again, when he says Hashpatat Chametz, and keeping the Chag for 7 days, and presumably having the Seder and talking about it, presumably they kept during that time in the Midbar, even though they didn't bring the Korban Pesach. That's what Ramban wants to say. Okay. The Netziv, Hamek Davar. Again, focus on this fact that it says Bashana Shenit in the second year. Whom yutar? Doesn't have to tell us that it's the second year. We know it's the second year. It's the first year that they're in the Midbar. Obviously, the last year ago, they were still in Egypt. Why would I have thought that suddenly the Torah skipped a year? Ella, Balalamdenu, this fact that it adds the word in the second year, as Ramban said before, only in year 2 were they commanded by Hashem specifically to make a Korban Pesach, and not the other 40 years. Keperish Rashi b'shem HaSifri, like Rashi explains, and Ramban as we saw. Ella Disham Tani Hadrash, there in the Sifrei it says the following. They use the verse by Yasur Pesach Rishon bi Arba Asar Yom Bignut Yisrael Diber Akasav Shlo Asar Esachseh Bilvad. That this pasuk is speaking negatively because they only did this one Pesach. V'cheinu Omer, and he goes the further pasuk from Amos Hasvachim Mechgashtim Liva Mikbar Bar Mishana. Baby Haramban, the Rambam brings us down. V'nidchak bePerush HaHochacha Mizah HaMikra. V'nira shehu midichsiv pratei hazman v'lo niskar hashana gam kain. It mentions the specific time, but it doesn't mention the year again. And that's what the Ramban said is where we derive the fact that this is the only one that they brought. And that's what Sifrei says. Ve'ilu mishum shehu somech al hatzivui lo haya lichtov azman klal. And if the pasuk was just simply wanted to say that they followed what Hashem said, we don't have to mention any time. Therefore, it doesn't write the year when if they fulfill the command, because it was already understood that it was in the second year. It was the first year that they were in the desert. A year ago, they were still in Egypt on Pesach. The Im Kain, if that's the case, why at the beginning of the parsha does it have to add that it's the second year? It's extra. That's why it's specifically to teach us that this was the only time they made the Korban Pesach. Nimtza. So all of this teaches us. We learn from these two psukim together that these extra words teach us that this is the only Korban Pesach they brought. And now, concerning why they didn't bring the Korban Pesach, why this sheds a negative light on Am Yisrael seems strange. It seems very, very far for me to say that this generation was lazy. The ones who stood at Har Sinai and created this brit with Hashem, that they were suddenly lazy in performing the mitzvah of Moshe. Moshe certainly was not lazy in fulfilling mitzvot. So why would somebody say that they didn't bring it because they were lazy? The Ein Lomar, and I also the Tzif Sai also doesn't make sense to me. That they were not circumcised because the north wind didn't blow. They were afraid to circumcise the children who were born. This would only have applied after children were born, so the next generation. The generation that left Egypt were all circumcised. So why didn't they, the ones who were circumcised, bring the Korban Pesach? The Nesivos wants to know. It doesn't make sense to say that the fact that they had uncircumcised male children would have kept the ones who were circumcised from bringing the Korban Pesach. Why? We know that the halacha is that if I have a child who is not circumcised, the only time that keeps me, who am circumcised, and Istahar from bringing Korban Pesach, when the time for his Brit Milah has already shown up. So if I have a brand new baby who's not yet reached 7 days, that doesn't keep me from being able to bring a Korban Pesach. Or if he is not being circumcised because of health reasons, because he's not able to be circumcised, that doesn't keep me from bringing in Korban Pesach. That's what the Nitziv wants to say. He needs a parak orel because that's the halacha. Okay, Daf Ayin Amud Ayin Aleph in if the child is sick and hasn't had his Brit Milah because he's sick, not because the parents are lazy and just don't feel like doing his Brit Milah, he hasn't had his Brit Milah because he's sick, that doesn't keep the parent from being able to bring his Korban Pesach. The two, and additionally, it brings this pasuk from Amos that they didn't bring Karbanot the whole 40 years. There is no Karban except for the Korban Pesach. Every other Karban, the fact that your children are not circumcised doesn't keep you from bringing any other Karban except the Korban Pesach when they could have had a circumcision. And tells you, this is all Gemara in Yevamot. So therefore, he doesn't like either of these reasons that the Ramban gave. The fact that they didn't bring it because they were lazy, or the fact that they didn't bring it because they had children who were not circumcised. The Ikar, but he says the primary reason, I think, like the Gemara in Kedushin writes, Shesfiro like Ketana. The Amar, the Bechol Makom Shenemar Bia. Anytime a mitzvah is commanded in the Torah that says when you arrive in Eretz Yisrael, it's only la'afar Yerusha v'yeshiva b'mashma. It means that this mitzvah is not incumbent upon Am Yisrael until they get to Eretz Yisrael, they inherit Eretz Yisrael, and they're all living in Eretz Yisrael, which doesn't happen until 14 years or at least 7 years after Yeshua gets to Am Yisrael gets to Eretz Yisrael under Yoshua. But Pesach Nemarbia, and concerning the Korban Pesach, we're not obligated to bring the Korban Pesach until we get into Eretz Yisrael and we're settled there. Ube'emet, in reality, lo hutzvah avotenu lezeh. We don't even need this extra drash that bia coming into Eretz Yisrael means inheritance and dwelling there. We don't even need that. Dilchule alma, everybody agrees bia la'aretz mi'abai, and they at least had to be in Eretz Yisrael to bring the Korban Pesach. Uchetane b'mechilta parsha yudbet tola kasav mitzvah zeh b'viyatan la'aretz. Like we learned in the Mechilta, that the mitzvah of Korban Pesach is specifically dependent on their entering Eretz Yisrael. There's no mitzvah of Korban Pesach before they get to Eretz Yisrael. Why is this considered negative? Why is it a negative reflection of Am Yisrael? Kamo kol karbanot, like any other karbanot, tamidim umusafim, sheikar tachlitan bishvil parnasa lo haya ela b'Eretz Yisrael. The primary reason we bring these karbanot is so that, or is only in Eretz Yisrael. Umikol makom, nonetheless, karb gam b'midbar. Even though the primary reason we bring many of these karbanot is to pray to Hashem that He should provide all the things we need to survive in Eretz Yisrael, which in the Midbar they certainly didn't need because they had the mun falling every day and they had the clouds protecting them, so they didn't need this extra karbanot for Hashem giving them the things they daily need on a regular basis. Nonetheless, he says karbanot were brought in the Midbar b'shvil yi'ud v'avad Hashem Yisrael, to show the love and the jointedness between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why they brought karbanot in the Midbar. As we see in the parsha, these are to show that Hashem loves Am Yisrael and wants to be close to us. And because of this, when Hashem distanced himself from Am Yisrael because of the ched of the meraglim, they no longer brought the Korban Tamid. There was no connection. The connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu was broken by the ched of the meraglim. Therefore, they did not bring the Korbanot. Kaf, so similar, HaPesach, she'ikar tchilato lezechirat Yitziat Mitzrayim. The primary purpose of the Pesach is to remember Yitziat Mitzrayim. The Tachlit HaSipur einu ela b'Eretz Yisrael. The primary reason we need this is when we get to Eretz Yisrael. We're going to explain later in parshat Rei that the primary purpose of remembering Yitziat Mitzrayim is so that we don't think that we always lived in Eretz Yisrael and that we, quote, own Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we remember that specifically through the Yitziat Mitzrayim, remembering that we didn't always, it's not something that we always did. We only landed Eretz Yisrael when Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. Mikol Moko, nonetheless, Gamba Bidbar Tziva Hashem Lavi Bismano, even though this year, they hadn't yet reached Eretz Yisrael, Hashem commanded them to bring the Korban Pesach, Yishum Yiyud V'Chavivut. The second year was before the Ched Meraglim. Therefore, Hashem and Am Yisrael were still connected. There was still this great link between them. There was still great love between them. Kasher Yivor B'Kras Hamuch, as we're going to see later on, there was so much love. We're going to see what happens. Okay, it's only after the Ched of the Meraglim, Shuv Lo Heviu, that they no longer brought the Korban Pesach. Now we can understand how you after the Farish Lashon HaSifrei, we can understand why. What is the Genut Yisrael that? Okay, 1 minute. The Im Kain, who I did. You call okay. Okay, now it's possible the Farish Lashon HaSifrei to explain what the Sifrei wrote. The Hashem was that this pasuk is negative, shines negative light on Yisrael. That through the Ched and the Meraglim, we caused ourselves to be distanced from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's impossible to say that. Why should it have explained this or pointed this out more in the Korban Pesach than any other Korban? The two, the ganut kol inyan hamaraglim lo nitzchul lemazmela, and the fact that chet hamaraglim was a terrible chet, and that Am Yisrael was distant from Kodesh Baruch, we don't need it to hint it just by switching the order of the parashot. El al karchacha haperush ganut al ha'eder hakrova beyichud haPesach. The fact is that the ganut is that they did not want to bring the Korban Pesach to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. והעניין דלהלן בספר דברים פרשת שמור חודש אביב יבואר בסוף סעת נשמע משונה פסח מכל הקורבנות שלא אפשר להקריב משחר בית המקדש אפילו כמזבח חיים. I'm going to explain further on that the Korban Pesach is different than every other Korban because it cannot be brought once there's no Beit HaMikdash. Yishum de kulan kativ reach nichoach. All the other Korbanot are kativ reach nichoach. Umishacharav Beit HaMikdash, and once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, kativ loa reach nichochem. Pesach is different. Every other Korban we cannot bring except when the Beit HaMikdash is around because they all say reach nichoach, that they are something that is, quote, a sweet smell to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And once the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, Hashem says he will no longer smell these, so we can't bring them. Masha'ain came to Pesach, which does not apply to the Korban Pesach. As a matter of fact, there are those that say if we were tahar, we could bring the Korban Pesach even today, even though there's no Beit HaMikdash, if we would just build a mizbeach in the right place. We don't need the whole Beit HaMikdash. The Im came, who adin midbar, the same thing would apply in the desert. Mishenasim menudim lo hayu cholim lakiv shuv korban shelo ba l'reach nichoach. They could not bring any of the other korbanot. Masha'ain came Pesach. However, the Pesach they could have brought the Korban Pesach, but there was no obligation to bring it. And this is why it's negative. They didn't strive to wake up to do this. But if there had been an obligation, they certainly would have brought it. The fact is, it was permissive. They could have brought the Korban Pesach. There was no obligation to bring it. But the fact that they didn't say, hey, we can do it, let's do it, that's what negatively reflects on Am Yisrael, the Nitziv wants to say. That's okay. I'm going to skip the rest of this because my time is running short, and I wanted to say one quick thing, even though he's almost at the end. But the fact is that as I said, the Chizkuni gives one reason basically, and the Nitziv gives another reason. The Nitziv basically wants to say that the reason why Am Yisrael did not is this negatively reflects is that Am Yisrael really didn't push to bring the Korban Pesach, which, by the way, is exactly the opposite of what happens in our chapter. As I said, if we go back now to the beginning of the chapter, we find that in reality this chapter should have only been 5 psukim long. It should have ended with Kasher Tzivah Hashem et Moshe, Kol Asher Tzivah Hashem Moshe Kein Asu B'nei Yisrael. At the end of Pasuk Hey, they brought the Korban Pesach. Hashem commanded. They brought it. End of discussion. This whole rest of this story about these people who were Tameh and the whole concept of Pesach Sheni really, I think, reflects very positively on Am Yisrael. Because here are these men who are exempt. They don't have to bring the Korban Pesach. They don't have to. They have a perfectly legitimate excuse for not bringing the Korban Pesach. But they wanted to perform the mitzvah. Their love for the mitzvah was such that they came forth and said, please, we really want to do this mitzvah. And that attitude, that thought process really is, I think, why this whole parsha is here, to show us that even though the parsha in its whole, as the parshanim want to say later on, in retrospect, 40 years later, it was not a positive parsha because Am Yisrael should have been by year 3 in Eretz Yisrael, or because whatever the reasons were that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach the rest of the years. But at least for this year, for the second year, I think it reflects very positively on Am Yisrael by the reaction of these people who were Tameh, had a perfect excuse not to bring it, and said, we want to do this mitzvah. And I think that's a very powerful lesson, that we have the opportunity many times where we don't have to do a mitzvah. It's a permissible mitzvah, or we may have a perfect excuse not for doing it. I think what the parasha wants to teach us very importantly, that when we strive to do mitzvot, even though we're not necessarily commanded, and even though we have a perfect excuse not for doing it, Hashem really takes that to heart. And that's why we find Hashem immediately answers Moshe and says, yes, we're going to give them an opportunity to perform this mitzvah. And I think that's a very, very powerful, powerful lesson for all of us to take home, that if we strive to do mitzvot, even if we're not commanded, and even if we have a perfect excuse, that will help bring the Geulah b'mheira b'yameinu. Thank you all. I hope I didn't get too out of order and forgetting where we're going. But I hope thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of the week. And I open up now for questions, comments, or feedback. Anybody? Okay. Have a good rest of the week. And Shabbat Shalom and Best Hashem. We'll see you all next week. Thank you all for joining, and have a Laila Tov.